My name is Emily Carter, and if you'd told me last spring that a single sentence from my husband would crack open my entire life, I would have laughed. But here I am. It started on an ordinary Saturday afternoon. We were in my late father's workshop, a dusty corner of our old barn in Vermont, sorting through boxes that smelled faintly of cedar and motor oil. My husband Luke was stacking crates when I noticed he'd gone still, his back rigid. He looked over at me, his eyes suddenly sharp, the warmth gone. "Don't say a word," he murmured, barely moving his lips. "Just keep working until my sister leaves." The hairs on my arms stood up. Luke isn't the dramatic type. He's steady, predictable, the kind of man who folds laundry while it's still warm. If his tone had an edge, something was wrong. My mind started firing in every direction. Was there an animal, a weapon, something dangerous? I glanced across the barn. His sister Megan was still kneeling by the old tool chest, rummaging through wrenches. She hummed softly some pop song from the 90s, completely unaware of the shift in the air. Luke's eyes stayed locked on me. I forced myself to turn back to the dusty crate in front of me, my fingers pretending to sift through bundles of frayed rope and broken clamps. My heart was doing a drum solo in my chest, but I kept my face neutral. 1,000 questions burned my tongue, but I swallowed them. Whatever Luke had found, he didn't want Megan to see it, didn't want her to even sense there was something to notice. That alone told me this wasn't some old photograph or silly trinket. This was bigger. The minutes stretched, the sound of Megan's humming scraping against my nerves. Finally, Luke stood and stretched casually, saying, "Meg, could you check if Mom still has that extra vacuum in the house? Might be easier than sweeping this place out." Megan nodded cheerfully, brushing dirt off her jeans. She left without a second glance. The moment the door shut, Luke walked toward me. No smile, no ease. Just a man who'd seen something he couldn't unsee. He didn't speak. He just jerked his chin toward the far wall, where an old armoire blocked a patch of wood paneling. I followed him each step, feeling heavier than the last. Behind that armoire, hidden beneath years of dust, was a small compartment in the wall, one I'd never noticed in all my childhood summers here. The wood around it was slightly lighter, as if it had been moved before. Luke stepped aside. "You should see this for yourself," he said quietly. I knelt down, my palms already damp, and eased the panel open. Inside was a battered metal cash box. No lock, no key, just a tarnished latch that clicked open under my thumb. What I saw inside didn't make sense at first. Manila envelopes neatly labeled, all in my name. Some were thin, others stuffed so full they barely closed. Dates spanning over 2 decades were scrawled in black ink across the corners. I looked up at Luke, my pulse hammering in my ears. He gave one slow nod, the kind that says, "Yes, it's exactly what you think." And worse. And that's when I realized whatever was inside these envelopes wasn't just forgotten paperwork. This was something someone had wanted to keep from me. For years. If you've ever had a moment where the ground shifts beneath you when you realize the people you trust might be hiding something, share your story below. Your words might be exactly what someone else needs to read tonight. Luke and I didn't speak for a moment. The air in that barn felt heavy, the smell of sawdust and oil thick in my nose. My hand still clutched the metal cash box, as if letting go might erase whatever was inside. From the yard, I could hear Megan's voice calling for our mother, cheerful and unknowing. Luke crouched beside me. "Close it," he whispered, "and wait until she's gone for good." His voice was steady, but I could see the muscle ticking in his jaw. I snapped the latch shut, slid the box back into the compartment, and replaced the wooden panel. We shoved the armoire into place, dust drifting down like old secrets refusing to settle. Then we went back to moving boxes like nothing had happened, my heart pounding against my ribs with every sound from the house. 5 minutes later, Megan poked her head through the door holding an ancient, upright vacuum. "Found it. Mom says it still works." She grinned, unaware that my pulse was rattling in my ears. Luke took it from her with a thanks, and after a bit of small talk, she wandered back to the house. The moment the barn door clicked shut, Luke turned to me. "We're not opening that here." We carried the box across the yard to our truck, trying to look casual. I could feel my mother-in-law's eyes on us from the kitchen window, though maybe it was just paranoia setting in. Luke slid the box behind the driver's seat, then leaned against the truck, crossing his arms. "Do you want to open it now?" he asked. "Yes," I said instantly. But even as the word left my lips, I knew the barn wasn't the right place. I didn't want walls that had heard every family argument to hear this. We drove the 15 minutes back to our small farmhouse in near silence. Every bump in the road seemed to jolt my thoughts loose. What could be in there? Old Will's land deeds, letters. My name on every envelope made my skin prickle. Once home, we carried the box into the kitchen. I set it on the table, staring at it the way you might stare at a snake, fascinated but wary. Luke sat down across from me. "Whenever you're ready," he said. I undid the latch. The hinges squealed softly as the lid lifted. Inside, the envelopes looked more deliberate now, like soldiers in formation. My name, Emily Carter, was printed in block letters on each one, some typed, some handwritten. I pulled out the first envelope. It was dated July 2003, 20 years ago. Inside was a crisp legal document with embossed seals and heavy paper stock. At the top, trust agreement. The language was formal clinical, but the meaning slammed into me like a freight train. A trust had been created in my name, the trustees, my parents-in-law. The terms were clear full disclosure and access to all assets upon my 18th birthday. My 18th birthday had passed nearly 15 years ago. My fingers shook as I reached for the second envelope. This one held photocopies of bank statements, accounts I'd never heard of, balances that made my chest tighten. Transactions marked scholarship fund and business grant peppered the pages, all drawn from the trust, all within the last decade. Luke leaned forward, his brow furrowing as he scanned the numbers. "Emily, this isn't just a little money." I nodded, my throat tight. Whoever had controlled this trust had used it, maybe for themselves, maybe for someone else, but never for me. I pulled another envelope. This one was thinner, lighter. Inside was a single letter handwritten in neat cursive. The paper was soft with age. "My dearest Emily, if you're reading this, then I am no longer here. I created this trust so you would always have something to build your life on." The words blurred as my eyes burned. The signature at the bottom made my breath hitch. Margaret Carter, my father's sister, my aunt. She'd died when I was a child, and I'd been told she left nothing behind. Luke reached over, covering my hand with his. "They lied to you," he said quietly. "For years." I folded the letter slowly, slid it back into its envelope, and placed it on the table. My pulse had steadied now, but the heat in my chest had turned into something colder resolve. "We're getting a lawyer," I said. Luke didn't even hesitate. "I'll make the calls." "Before I go further, I want to ask you, have you ever uncovered something your family never wanted you to know? Share it in the comments. Sometimes just telling it out loud can be the first step in taking back your power." I didn't sleep that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the neat handwriting of Aunt Margaret, the careful way she'd addressed the letter to me, as if she really knew that one day I'd need proof of who I was and what was mine. By morning, the sunlight spilling into the kitchen felt almost insulting. It was the same golden light I'd grown up under in this very town, surrounded by people who'd smiled at me at church picnics and 4th of July parades. People who probably had no idea my life was built on a lie. Or maybe they did and just decided it wasn't their business. Luke made coffee, sliding a mug toward me. I hadn't asked for it, but he knew I'd need it. My hands wrapped around the ceramic like I could siphon some kind of stability from it. "You should read the rest," Luke said gently. So I did. The second page of Margaret's letter hit harder than the first. "Your mother, Claire, was my younger sister. She passed away when you were too young to remember her, but I promised her I'd make sure you had a future she never got. That's why I created this trust, so no matter what, you'd have a foundation to stand on. I asked your father's family to be your guardians, to tell you the truth when you turned 18, and to hand everything over. If they've done that, then you're reading this with a heart full of gratitude. If they haven't, then I am so sorry, Emily. You deserve to know who you are and what's yours." My stomach twisted. I thought of every birthday card from my in-laws, short generic messages signed Mom and Dad, as if those titles were theirs to own forever. I thought of the times they'd told me they'd done everything for me, and how I should be grateful. Now I knew exactly what they meant. The legal documents were airtight, clear instructions, formal language, witness signatures, notarization. There was no ambiguity. By law, they should have handed me everything on my 18th birthday. Instead, the record showed withdrawals, transfers, and payments, all to fund things that had nothing to do with me. Luke sat beside me as I spread the papers across the table like a crime scene map. "This is theft," he said simply, "and fraud." I wanted to argue, to cling to the possibility of some misunderstanding. But the numbers didn't lie. Neither did Margaret's voice in that letter. By mid-morning, I was on the phone with a local attorney recommended by one of Luke's coworkers. I explained everything in a steady voice, though my hands trembled against the receiver. When I finished, there was a long pause on the other end. "Bring the documents in," the attorney said. "And Emily, don't tell them what you found, not yet." That afternoon, we drove into town. The attorney, a sharp-eyed woman named Catherine, listened without interrupting as I laid out the letters, bank statements, and trust paperwork on her desk. She read each one slowly, her lips pressed into a thin line. "This isn't just a breach of trust," she said finally. "This is a complete violation of fiduciary duty. You have a right to demand a full accounting, and if the funds have been misappropriated, to recover them." "What's the first step?" I asked. "We send them a formal demand letter. It'll be polite, professional, and impossible to ignore." That evening, back at home, Luke and I sat at the kitchen table, drafting the letter with Catherine over email. Every sentence felt like loading a bullet into a chamber, calm, precise, and inevitable. By the time we finished, it was ready to be printed on crisp letterhead, sealed in an envelope, and sent certified mail. As Luke signed the final page, he looked at me. "Once we do this, there's no going back." I met his gaze without hesitation. There's nothing to go back to. We didn't talk much the rest of the night. The box still sat on the counter, its lid open like a wound that refused to close. I thought about Margaret, how she must have known that if the trust fell into the wrong hands, it could be twisted into something ugly. And she'd been right. Lying in bed later, I stared at the ceiling and realized I wasn't just fighting for money. I was fighting for the truth of my own life. And for the first time in years, that fight felt worth every ounce of energy I had left. If you've ever had to stand up to family for what's right, even when it meant burning bridges, tell me about it in the comments. You never know who might find courage in your story. 3 days after Catherine mailed the letter, the first crack in the silence came. My phone lit up at exactly 10:02 a.m. with a name I hadn't seen in weeks, Linda Carter. My so-called mother. I let it ring twice before answering. "Emily," she said, skipping any greeting. Her tone was sharp enough to cut glass. "Are you serious? You're suing us?" "Not hi. Not what's going on. Just straight into indignation." "I'm requesting an accounting," I said evenly. "You ungrateful girl," she snapped. "We took you in, fed you, clothed, you paid for your school. With my own trust money," I cut in. There was a pause just long enough to tell me I'd hit something tender. Then came the background noises, muffled movement, a second voice. My father Harold barking from somewhere nearby. "Tell her we'll fight it. We're not letting her destroy everything." They were on speakerphone. Of course they were. "You're not a victim," Emily, Linda spat. "We did what we had to do. And it wasn't even that much money." "I'll see how much when the accounting comes in," I said. She scoffed, a sound I'd grown up with, the sound of dismissal. "You think getting a few dollars will fix you. You've always been so sensitive." That word sensitive was their favorite weapon. The label they used to turn my reactions into the problem rather than their actions. "Don't call me again unless it's through the lawyer," I said and hung up. When I set the phone down, Luke was watching from the doorway, his arms folded. He didn't ask what she'd said. He didn't need to. 2 days later, the second blow came not by phone, but by door. A knock I recognized instantly, sharp, insistent, the way Linda always knocked when she was about to pop in with unsolicited advice. When I opened the door there, they were Linda and Harold, smiling, like the last conversation had never happened. Linda held a Tupperware of oatmeal cookies, the kind she baked when she was trying to sweeten bad news. "We thought we'd talk face to face," she said, breezing past me into the living room. "Like a family." Luke stayed in the kitchen within earshot, but out of sight. He trusts me to fight my own battles. I didn't sit. "Where did the money go?" I asked. Linda blinked. "What money?" "The trust. Where did it go?" Her smile faltered. "We used it where it mattered." "So it did go to Jacob," I said, naming my cousin the golden boy of the Carter clan, college-educated, debt-free, with a shiny real estate business everyone bragged about. Linda's jaw tightened. Harold's voice was low but final. "It went to someone who deserved it." That was it. No apology, no remorse, just confirmation. I opened the front door and stood aside. "Then you can leave." Linda's eyes narrowed. She stepped toward me, cookies still in hand. "You're not our daughter anymore. Hope you're happy." I didn't answer. They stepped out. She left the Tupperware on the coffee table as if it were some parting gift. That night, I slid the cookies into the trash one by one. Then I wrote an email to Catherine, proceed with the suit. Include Jacob. Luke read it over my shoulder, then quietly put the kettle on. He didn't say a word, but the tea he set in front of me said enough. "I'm with you. All the way." Sometimes the people who raised you aren't the ones who deserve to keep you. If you've ever had to redefine family, I'd like to hear how you did it. Drop it in the comments so others can find the strength to do the same. After that night, the air in our house felt different. Quieter, but not in a peaceful way, more like the stillness before a storm. The cookies were gone, the email to Catherine was sent, and there was no way to undo any of it. Luke kept busy in the garden the next morning, trimming hedges with the kind of focus that comes from needing to keep your hands occupied so your mind doesn't spiral. I stayed inside, rereading Margaret's letter, each line etching itself deeper into my chest. It was the one steady truth I had now. The phone stayed silent for almost a week. But silence doesn't mean nothing's happening. It means the other side is gathering, deciding their next move. I knew Linda and Harold well enough to know they wouldn't stay quiet out of guilt. On the 8th day, a padded envelope arrived in our mailbox. No return address. Inside was a single piece of paper, a typed offer $150,000 if I dropped the case entirely. No apology, no explanation. Just a number and a thinly veiled threat that any further action would only cause harm to all involved. Luke read it over my shoulder. "They're nervous," he said. "They're insulting me," I replied. That night over dinner, I couldn't help thinking about how they'd chosen the number. Not too low to be laughable, but not close to the figures in the trust documents. It was bait. And here's where I want to ask you something, because I'm genuinely curious. If you were me, would you take the money and walk away, or keep going knowing it could get uglier? I know what I chose, but I want to know where you'd draw the line. Would it be about the money, or about the principle? Drop your thoughts in the comments. After clearing the table, I sat down at my desk and opened my journal. Writing helps me think, and that night I needed clarity. The pages filled quickly, lists of pros and cons, reminders of why I'd started this, a timeline of every lie I'd been told. By the time I put the pen down, I realized something walking away now wouldn't buy peace. It would buy silence. And silence is exactly what they'd counted on for years. The next morning I called Catherine. "We're not taking it," I told her. "I didn't think you would," she said, her voice steady. "The next step is depositions. And Emily, once we start those, the gloves come off." It didn't scare me. If anything, it lit something in me that had been dim for years. They'd taken more than money, they'd taken my history, my family's truth, and twisted it for their convenience. If that meant dragging everything into the light, so be it. That afternoon, I went for a long walk through town. I passed the bakery where Linda used to buy pies for Sunday dinners, the library where Margaret had volunteered in the children's section, the bench in the park where Harold once sat with me after my high school graduation. Every landmark felt different now, less like home, more like a crime scene. When I got back, Luke was sitting on the porch step sipping iced tea. "You ready for this to get messy?" he asked. "It's already messy," I said, lowering myself beside him. "I'm ready for it to be over." He clinked his glass lightly against mine. "Then let's finish it." We sat there until the sun dipped behind the trees, saying nothing, just breathing the same air, knowing the next chapter was going to test us in ways we couldn't yet imagine. But at least now I wasn't walking into it alone. The depositions were scheduled for the following Thursday in a beige conference room on the 3rd floor of a law office that smelled faintly of burnt coffee and printer ink. Catherine had warned me it would feel clinical, almost boring, until it wasn't. I sat at the end of the long table, Luke on my left, Catherine on my right. Across from us sat Linda, her arms folded, and Harold staring at some fixed point on the wall, as if pretending this wasn't happening. Jacob was there too, wearing a navy blazer that looked like it had been borrowed for the day. The court reporter sat up in the corner, fingers poised over the stenograph. Catherine began with the basics: names, addresses, dates. The room felt heavy with the kind of tension you can almost chew through. Then came the questions that mattered. Mrs. Carter Catherine said, her tone polite but precise. "Can you explain why the trust created in Emily Carter's name was never disclosed to her upon her 18th birthday?" Linda shifted in her seat. "We didn't think she was ready." "Ready for what?" "To handle that kind of responsibility." "So you decided without her consent to use the funds for other purposes." Linda's lips thinned. "We used them where they were needed." Catherine didn't look away. "And by needed, you mean paying for Jacob's tuition, his business startup costs, and the down payment on his house." Jacob cleared his throat, glancing at Linda like a child waiting for permission to speak. "I didn't know it was her money," he said finally. Catherine slid a document across the table. Is this your signature on the scholarship acceptance form? Jacob looked down. Yes. And you see the name at the top, Emily Carter, as the beneficiary of the trust? His silence was answer enough. For the next hour, the questions peeled back every layer of their defense. The paper trail was undeniable withdrawals labeled educational support, investment, family assistance, all drawn from accounts tied directly to the trust. I didn't speak much, but when I did, it was to correct details, dates, amounts. I wanted them to know I'd done my homework, that I wasn't here to be gaslit into forgetting the facts. By the time the depositions ended, Linda's face was flushed, Harold's jaw tight, and Jacob's hands fidgeting in his lap. Catherine gathered the files calmly, her voice, even as she said, "Thank you for your cooperation. We'll see you in court." Outside, the late afternoon sun felt like stepping into another world. Luke exhaled slowly, like he'd been holding his breath for hours. "You okay?" he asked. I nodded, but my thoughts were still in that room, circling the same questions. Why did they think they could get away with it? Was it arrogance, entitlement, or just the certainty that I'd never find out? As we drove home, Luke reached over, resting his hand on mine. You know, he said there's going to be a moment when they realize they've already lost. Might not be in the courtroom, might be before, but it's coming. That night, I sat at my desk again, flipping through Margaret's letter. Her words felt heavier now, not just because of what I knew, but because I could finally see the gap between what she'd wanted for me and what they'd done. And here's where I want your perspective. Do you think some betrayals are unforgivable? Or do you believe every family fracture can be repaired if enough time passes? I'm not sure where I stand yet, and maybe hearing your stories will help me see it more clearly. Luke found me still reading when he came in from locking up. Bed, he asked. In a minute, I said. But really, I just needed one more moment with that letter to remind myself that no matter what they'd taken, the truth was mine now, and they couldn't take that back. The week after the depositions, things began to shift in ways I could feel, but not yet name. It wasn't that Linda and Harold suddenly stopped fighting. If anything, the calls to Catherine's office became more frequent, full of bluster and indignation. But there was something underneath it now, a current of unease, like they were finally realizing this wasn't going to just fade away. Luke noticed it too. We'd get groceries in town and see Harold's truck parked outside the hardware store, but he wouldn't come in. Linda, who used to make a point of bumping into me at the farmer's market, was suddenly nowhere to be found. Even Jacob, the cousin, who once couldn't shut up about his entrepreneurial vision, had gone quiet on social media. Then came the envelopes. Not from lawyers, but from the bank statements for accounts I'd never seen before. Catherine explained they were part of the court-ordered discovery process, and each one told the same story: withdrawals in my name redirected to fund a lifestyle that wasn't mine, trips to Aspen renovations on Harold's rental properties, and my personal favorite, an $18,000 consulting fee paid to Jacob the same month I was working double shifts to cover my rent. I couldn't stop thinking about that. About how I'd spent my 20s cutting coupons and eating boxed macaroni while my trust was footing the bill for someone else's luxury ski trip. The unfairness wasn't abstract anymore, it was concrete, documented, undeniable. That night, Luke and I sat at the kitchen table with Catherine going through the stack of statements. This, she said, tapping the papers, is the kind of evidence juries understand. Numbers don't lie. And when you line them up against the trust documents, it's devastating. I felt the heat in my chest again, but it was different now. Less like panic, more like fuel. So what's next? I asked. Next, Catherine said we make it clear this case isn't about negotiation anymore. It's about judgment. The word hit me hard. Judgment. Not just legal judgment, but the kind that strips away the masks people wear in public. I imagined Linda and Harold in that courtroom, stripped of the narrative they'd spent years perfecting, that they'd rescued me, that everything they did was for my own good. Luke reached over his hand, steady on mine. They've gotten away with this for too long, he said. Now they're going to have to sit there and hear the truth out loud. It made me think of something Margaret had written in her letter. I hope you've never gone through life feeling like you came second. For years I had. And now, with every bank statement and deposition transcript, that lie was crumbling. Still, there was a part of me that wondered how far this would go. Could there be more I didn't know about other accounts, other lies I thought I'd already dug to the bottom? But experience had taught me that with Linda and Harold, there was always another layer. And maybe that's what kept me going, not just the fight for what was mine, but the need to see the whole picture, however ugly it might be. Luke poured me another cup of tea. "You okay?" he asked. "Better than I've been in years," I said. And it was true. For the first time, I wasn't just surviving whatever they threw at me. I was the one pushing forward, and they were the ones scrambling to keep up. By the time the leaves began to turn, the fight had taken on a rhythm. Court dates, filings, phone calls, late-night strategy sessions with Catherine. I was no longer shocked by the numbers I saw. If anything, each new statement just hardened my resolve. But it was the smaller details that got under my skin. The credit card charges labeled family gifts during years when my own Christmas was a thrift store sweater and a $20 grocery card. The emergency repairs to Harold's vacation cabin the same month my car broke down and I had to take the bus to work for 6 weeks. It was like flipping through an alternate version of my life, one where my trust had been used the way Margaret intended. And I couldn't stop wondering who I would have been if I'd had that foundation, instead of starting every year in survival mode. One evening, Luke came in from the porch holding a manila envelope. "This just got dropped off," he said. "No postage. Someone left it in the mailbox." Inside was a stack of photographs. At first, they didn't make sense. Harold and Jacob standing in front of a sleek boat, Linda at a wine tasting in Napa, all of them smiling in clothes I'd never seen before. The timestamps in the corners told me everything. These were taken during the exact years I was scraping by. There was no note, just the pictures delivered like a quiet confession from someone who'd been watching. Luke leaned over my shoulder. "Who do you think sent these?" I shook my head. "Doesn't matter. What matters is that now we have faces to go with the numbers." The next morning, I brought the photos to Catherine. She barely looked surprised. "This is exactly the kind of visual evidence that lands in a jury's memory," she said. "Dates, faces, context. It makes it real." Walking out of her office, I felt lighter, but also more dangerous. For years, Linda and Harold had told themselves a story where they were the benevolent caretakers, the ones who had sacrificed for me. Now the truth was coming into focus, and it was going to be public. That night, I spread the photos out on our dining table, lining them up in chronological order. Luke joined me, pointing out the patterns, how the biggest expenditures lined up perfectly with withdrawals from my trust. "Feels like a puzzle," he said, "except they didn't think you'd ever get all the pieces." "They underestimated me," I replied. We stayed there for hours, the photographs and statements forming a timeline that told a single, undeniable story. They'd taken what was mine, and they'd built their comfort on my loss. I thought about Margaret again, about the way she'd written, "I hope you've never gone through life feeling like you came second." The truth was I had, and I wasn't willing to live another day in that place. The trial date was now just a week away, and everything felt like it was vibrating under the surface. Catherine had filed the last round of exhibits, bank statements, trust documents, photographs, and the court had accepted them without challenge. That was the moment I knew Linda and Harold's defense was on borrowed time. But there was one thing Catherine hadn't told me yet. "I've been holding back a piece of evidence," she said one evening when Luke and I met her at her office. "Not because it's weak, because its timing is everything." She slid a slim folder across the desk. "I want to use this in the middle of cross-examination. It's the kind of detail that doesn't just prove a point, it erases the story they've been telling." I opened the folder and my breath caught. It wasn't just more bank statements, it was an email. From Linda to Jacob, dated 5 years ago, subject line trust funds. The message was short. "Make sure to keep the withdrawals under $50K each so the bank doesn't flag it. Emily doesn't know, and she won't unless she starts digging. And she's not that type." Luke leaned over my shoulder, his jaw tightening. "They put it in writing." "They put it in writing," Catherine confirmed. "And the date proves they knew the money was hers, knew they were hiding it, and knew they were banking on you never asking questions." I sat back, the edges of the folder pressing into my palms. "Why didn't you show me this earlier?" "Because I want it to land at exactly the right moment," Catherine said. "When they're feeling confident, when they think they've controlled the narrative. Then we drop this and watch it collapse." On the drive home, Luke kept glancing at me. "You okay?" "Yeah," I said, though my mind was already playing out the scene. Linda on the stand. The email read aloud, the jurors' eyes flicking between her and the paper in front of them. That was the moment they'd realized this wasn't about misunderstanding or family disagreements. This was about calculated theft. But here's the thing, I wasn't just thinking about the courtroom. I was thinking about what would happen after. Because once that email was out there, it wouldn't just be the jury who knew. It would be our entire town. The people at the grocery store. The neighbors who'd waved at Linda for years. The ones who'd believed her story. And that's where I want to pull you in. If you knew that exposing the truth would also publicly humiliate the people who wronged you, would you still do it? Would you choose full daylight, knowing there's no way back into the shadows after? Luke parked the truck in our driveway, the porch light glowing against the dark. Whatever happens next, he said, you're ready for it. I wasn't sure if ready was the word, but I knew I was done being the person who didn't dig, who took whatever scraps were handed to her. 1 week from now, everything would change, and part of me couldn't wait to see how fast their carefully built story would burn. The first day of the trial started under a pale gray sky, the kind that made the courthouse steps look colder than they really were. Luke and I walked in side by side, our footsteps echoing on the marble floor. Catherine was already there, leaning against the railing outside the courtroom doors, her briefcase balanced at her feet, like a soldier ready for battle. Inside the room smelled faintly of paper and tension. The jury sat in 2 neat rows, their eyes scanning us as we took our seats. Across the aisle, Linda wore a pale blue blazer that I recognized from a Christmas photo 3 years ago, back when she still spoke to me with something resembling warmth. Harold sat rigid beside her, his gaze fixed on the table in front of him. Jacob was farther down, flipping through a folder without really looking at it. The opening statements were exactly what I expected, Catherine's calm, deliberate voice, laying out the trust's creation, the legal obligations, the evidence of withdrawals. Then the opposing counsel stood and tried to reframe everything as a family matter gone wrong, heavy on words like misunderstanding and miscommunication. It didn't matter. Once the first witness took the stand, an officer from the bank, the shape of the story began to harden. He confirmed the accounts were tied to my trust, confirmed the pattern of withdrawals, and confirmed the beneficiaries had been legally obligated to disclose the trust to me on my 18th birthday. Then came my turn. Sitting in that witness chair felt like standing on the edge of a cliff with the wind in my face. Catherine guided me through the questions gently, her voice steady enough to make me forget for a few minutes that Linda was sitting just feet away. We covered the basics, my relationship with Margaret, the letter she'd written the day Luke and I found the box in the barn. Every word felt heavier with the jury's eyes on me. And then opposing counsel tried their angle. Emily, wouldn't you agree that Linda and Harold supported you for years without asking for anything in return? They supported me, I said, using my own money. A ripple went through the courtroom. The attorney tried again. But isn't it true that you never asked about the trust before this year? I looked him straight in the eye. It's hard to ask about something you don't know exists. Catherine didn't hide her smile. By the afternoon, Jacob was on the stand. Watching him squirm under Catherine's cross-examination was almost surreal. She walked him through the scholarship acceptance form, the bank transfers, and the business grant labeled under his name, all pulled from my trust. Did you know these funds belong to Emily Carter, she asked. He hesitated just long enough for the silence to fill the room. I knew they were from the family. And you knew, Catherine pressed, that the family was legally obligated to disclose the trust to her, correct? His shoulders sagged. Yes. The jurors were watching him closely now, their pens still against their notepads. When the judge finally adjourned for the day, I felt a strange mix of exhaustion and adrenaline. Luke put his arm around me as we stepped into the hallway. That, he said quietly, was the beginning of the end for them. I wasn't so sure yet. I knew the real blow was still coming. Catherine still had that email in her folder, waiting for the perfect moment to set it loose. Day 2 of the trial began with the kind of quiet that doesn't feel calm. It feels like the inhale before a scream. Luke and I arrived early, but Linda and Harold were already inside, whispering with their lawyer. Jacob sat apart from them, scrolling on his phone like none of this had anything to do with him. Catherine leaned toward me as we took our seats. Today's the day we turn their story inside out, she murmured. I knew what she meant, the email. The morning testimony was almost procedural, more bank officials confirming transfers, a forensic accountant walking the jury through how the trust funds were spent. It was all damaging, but it was still numbers on paper. The defense clung to their narrative that it was all family resources pooled together for shared benefit. Then just after lunch, Catherine called Linda to the stand. I could tell Linda thought she was ready. She smoothed her blazer, adjusted her glasses, and walked up with her chin high. Her lawyer had prepped her for this moment. Stay calm, look maternal, keep the story simple. For the first few questions, she did exactly that. Catherine let her talk, explaining how she and Harold had done what was best for me, how they protected me from responsibilities I wasn't ready for. And then Catherine pivoted. Mrs. Carter, I'd like to show you Exhibit 47. The bailiff handed Linda a printed email. I recognized it instantly. Trust funds keep withdrawals under 50K. Emily doesn't know. Linda's eyes flicked over the page, and in that flicker I saw it: recognition, then panic, then the mask snapping back into place. Do you recall sending this email to Jacob Carter on March 14th, 5 years ago? Catherine asked. Linda hesitated. I'd have to check my records. Let me help you, Catherine said, her tone even. This is from your personal email account. The date matches the bank withdrawals made that week, 2 separate transfers of $500 each. Would you like me to read it aloud? Linda's lawyer shifted in his seat. Objection, overruled, the judge said. Catherine read the words slowly, each syllable deliberate. Make sure to keep the withdrawals under 50K high each so the bank doesn't flag it. Emily doesn't know, and she won't unless she starts digging. And she's not that type. The jury was watching Linda now, not Catherine, waiting for her to explain. I was just simplifying things, Linda stammered. It wasn't... So you admit you were aware the money belonged to Emily? Catherine interrupted, and that you intentionally structured the withdrawals to avoid detection. Linda's mouth opened, then closed. I didn't think... No, Catherine said, leaning in just slightly. You did think. You thought she'd never dig. You thought you could take what wasn't yours and hide it in plain sight. The silence in the room was thick enough to taste. From the corner of my eye, I saw Jacob sink lower in his seat. Harold stared straight ahead, his jaw clenched tight. Catherine let the silence hang for a few more beats before thanking Linda and stepping back. The judge dismissed her from the stand, but the damage was done. When the session ended for the day, Luke and I walked out into the crisp autumn air. They can't come back from that, he said. I believed him. For the first time, I truly believed the end was in sight. But I also knew something else. The worst fallout wasn't going to happen in the courtroom. It was going to happen after, when they had to live with what everyone now knew. The morning after Linda's testimony, the town already seemed to know. We stopped at the diner for coffee before court, and I could feel the shift the moment we walked in. Heads turned. Conversations dipped for just a beat, before resuming quieter now, like I'd just walked into the middle of someone's sentence. Luke ordered for us while I scanned the room. At least 3 people I recognized from the neighborhood were sitting together in the back booth. One of them was pretending to scroll her phone, but kept glancing up at me. Word travels fast in small towns, but this was faster. Linda's email hadn't just cracked her credibility in court, it had detonated her reputation in public. When we got to the courthouse, Catherine was waiting on the steps. I think they're going to try something desperate today, she said. Be ready for theatrics. She was right. Inside, Harold took the stand. He tried to play the role of the calm, reasonable guardian, talking about family decisions and investments for the greater good. But Catherine dismantled him piece by piece, using the same methodical approach she'd used with Linda. Then Harold made a mistake. He claimed that every major withdrawal had been for a necessary expense tied to my well-being. Catherine raised an eyebrow and pulled out a bank record from 2018. Mr. Carter, can you explain why a necessary expense for Emily Carter was charged to a luxury resort in Maui room service spa packages and 3 first-class tickets? Harold's jaw worked, but no sound came out. That was a family trip, to which Emily Carter was not invited. Catherine said, her voice like a scalpel. The jury's pens were moving again. By the time court adjourned, Linda and Harold were walking faster than usual toward the exit, their lawyer trailing behind them with a face like stone. Jacob didn't even try to catch up. He stayed behind, pretending to read something on his phone. In the truck, Luke looked over at me. They're unraveling. You can see it. Yeah, I said, watching the courthouse fade in the rearview mirror. But I don't think we've seen the worst of it yet. And here's the thing, what's coming next isn't just about numbers or documents. It's about a truth so personal, so deeply buried, that once it comes out, there's no way to put it back. Catherine had hinted at it weeks ago, just a flicker in her voice when we were going through the trust paperwork. At the time, I thought it was just a stray observation. But now I knew she'd been holding it for the same reason she'd held the email timing. Luke must have read the look on my face. What is it? Something bigger, I said. Something they've been hiding even longer than the money. His hands tightened on the steering wheel. Then let's burn it all down. I didn't answer, not because I didn't agree, but because part of me still couldn't believe how far they'd gone, not just to take what wasn't theirs, but to rewrite who I was. One more day, maybe 2, and the whole thing would be out. And when it was even the people who'd been willing to give them the benefit of the doubt would see the truth for what it was. The next morning, the courthouse felt different, charged, like everyone sensed we were on the edge of something. Even the court clerk, usually brisk and impersonal, gave me a quick, curious glance before pointing me toward my seat. Catherine leaned in as we settled at the table. "They're rattled," she said quietly. "You can tell by how many people they've brought today. Family, friends, neighbors. Maybe they think having a crowd will make them look respectable." I glanced over my shoulder. Sure enough, the first 2 rows behind Linda and Harold were filled with familiar faces, people who'd once waved at me on Main Street or asked about my garden at the farmer's market. Today their smiles were tighter guarded. The morning started with Jacob back on the stand. He was visibly less polished than the first time, shoulders slouched, eyes darting between Catherine and the jury. She revisited his scholarship application, walking him through the fine print where my name appeared as the beneficiary. "And at the time you accepted these funds," Catherine asked, "did you believe they were offered freely?" He hesitated. I thought it was family helping family. "But you knew they came from a trust established in my client's name." "Yes." The word hung there, small but devastating. Jacob was dismissed and the judge called for a short recess. Luke and I stepped into the hallway away from the chattering crowd. He handed me a paper cup of water. "You're holding up better than I expected," he said. "I'm not here to crumble," I told him. "Not when we're this close." When we returned, Catherine called me back to the stand for a brief redirect. She asked about the day I found the box in the barn, about Margaret's letter, about the exact wording in the trust documents. It was all factual steady until she asked one last question. "Emily," she said, "has anyone ever told you why your Aunt Margaret Carter was so insistent that this trust be given to you, and only you?" My pulse jumped. "No," I said, "not directly." Catherine nodded slowly. "We'll come back to that." It was a subtle move, but I saw it land. The jurors exchanged quick glances, pens, pausing mid-note. The gallery leaned in just a little. Even Linda straightened in her seat as if bracing for something. Luke caught my eye from the bench behind Catherine, his expression a mix of pride and understanding. We both knew what she'd done. She'd planted the seed. The question of why was now hanging in the air, and it wouldn't be answered until Catherine decided the time was right. That's when I realized something. This trial wasn't just about proving they'd stolen from me. It was about showing everyone exactly what they'd been trying to keep buried all along. And trust me, what's coming next will change everything you think you know about this case. The courtroom was so still that I could hear the faint hum of the overhead lights when the judge called us back from the afternoon recess. Catherine stood smoothing the front of her blazer and said, "Your Honor, we'd like to recall Emily Carter to the stand." I walked up every step, echoing in my chest. Luke's eyes followed me, steady as a lifeline. Catherine didn't waste time. "Emily," she began yesterday, "you testified that no one had ever told you why Margaret Carter created this trust, specifically for you. Is that correct?" "Yes." Catherine turned toward the jury. "We're about to answer that question." She reached into her briefcase and pulled out a manila envelope. This document was obtained through the court's subpoena process. It is Margaret Carter's last will and testament, along with a sworn affidavit she wrote in the same week she established the trust. The bailiff handed copies to the jury and the judge. Catherine's voice was calm, but the weight in it was unmistakable. "Please read the highlighted portion, Emily," she said, handing me my copy. My hands trembled as I found the line written in Margaret's unmistakable cursive, "Emily is my biological daughter, born when I was 44 years old. For personal reasons, and with the agreement of my younger brother Harold and his wife Linda, it was decided they would raise her as their own. This arrangement was conditional on full disclosure to Emily by her 18th birthday and the preservation of all trust assets for her sole benefit." A gasp rippled through the gallery. I felt the floor tilt under me, my breath catching in my throat. My mind replayed decades of memories, Linda's backhanded comments, Harold's controlling silences, now reframed with the knowledge that they weren't my parents at all. They were my uncle and aunt, and they had stolen not only my money, but my truth. Catherine let the silence stretch before she asked, "Emily, is this the first time you have seen this document?" "Yes," I said, my voice steadier than I expected. "Did Linda or Harold ever tell you Margaret was your mother?" "No." "Did they ever tell you that the trust was intended to be your inheritance from your biological mother?" "No." Across the aisle, Linda's face had gone pale, her jaw tight, as if holding back words that could only make things worse. Harold stared at the tabletop, his hands clasped so tightly his knuckles were white. Catherine addressed the jury. Not only did the defendants misappropriate funds meant for Emily, they concealed her true parentage for decades, denying her the opportunity to know the truth about her identity and her mother's intentions. This was not protection. This was theft of money and of self. I looked at the jurors, saw their eyes on me not with pity, but with something heavier, a recognition of the enormity of what had been taken. When Catherine finished, the judge recessed for the day. Outside the courthouse, the crisp air hit me like a slap. Luke wrapped an arm around me, and for a long moment I just stood there, the words from that affidavit looping in my head. Emily is my biological daughter. I guess I said finally, the truth really does set you free, but it can break you first. Luke squeezed my shoulder. They don't get to break you anymore. The next morning I walked into the courthouse with my head higher than it had been in months. The air felt different now, not lighter, but sharper, like every breath carried purpose. The jurors avoided looking at Linda and Harold as they filed in. That alone told me the tide had turned. Closing arguments began promptly. Catherine went first. She didn't raise her voice, didn't need theatrics, she just laid the entire story bare. She reminded the jury of the trust documents, the decades of concealment, the bank statements, the luxury expenses, the email that spelled out intent to hide withdrawals, and finally the affidavit proving my biological mother's identity. This case, she said, is not about misunderstandings or family disagreements. It is about calculated deception and theft. It is about denying a woman her rightful inheritance and the truth of her own life. The law demands justice, and we are asking you to deliver it. The defense tried to recover ground, painting themselves as flawed but well-meaning. They claimed they'd acted in Emily's best interest, argued that revealing the truth earlier would have been destabilizing, and insisted the money had been used responsibly for family needs. But I could feel the hollowness in the room. No one was buying it. When the judge read the verdict, the words felt surreal, even though I'd been hoping for them guilty on all counts of breach of fiduciary duty, misappropriation of trust assets, and intentional infliction of emotional distress. The judgment was clear: full restitution of remaining assets, liquidation of certain properties, and transfer of the trust back into my control. Linda stared straight ahead. Harold's shoulders sagged. Jacob wasn't even in the room. As the court adjourned, Catherine turned to me with a rare smile. It's over. But she and I both knew that over was a relative term. The legal battle had ended, but the personal fallout was just beginning. Word would spread faster now. Newspaper articles whispered conversations at church, awkward silences at the grocery store. They would live in the shadow of what they'd done, and I would live in the light of what I'd reclaimed. Walking down the courthouse steps, Luke slid his hand into mine. You did it, he said. We did it, I corrected. And here's where I want to leave you with something to think about. What would you have done in my place? Would you have fought it out in court, knowing the emotional cost, or taken the quiet deal and walked away? Your answer might reveal more about what you value most: peace or justice. If you want to see what happened next, how the aftermath unfolded, what I chose to do with the restitution, and the final piece of Margaret's story, you can watch my follow-up video. It's not just the ending of this case, it's the beginning of what I'm building now. The weeks after the verdict felt strangely quiet. There were no more depositions, no more tense mornings at the courthouse, no more legal pads covered in Catherine's sharp handwriting. Just open days, the kind that felt like they belonged entirely to me for the first time in my life. Luke and I moved into a smaller house with wide sunlit windows. The first morning there, I brewed coffee and stood barefoot on the porch watching the light spill over the yard. No one could take this moment from me. I began sorting through the boxes from Margaret's trust, not as evidence anymore, but as pieces of a story I wanted to keep. I reread her letters, traced the ink where her pen had paused, and felt the warmth of someone who had planned for me even when she wouldn't be here to see it. One afternoon, I met with Marisol, an old friend of Margaret's. She brought photographs I'd never seen: my mother holding me as a baby, laughing in a way that lit up her whole face. Marisol told me stories about her: how she loved music, how she painted late into the night, how she had been certain her daughter would grow into a woman who knew her own worth. For the first time, I felt like I was standing fully in my own skin. Not the girl they raised, not the one who didn't know, but Emily, Margaret's daughter, holding everything that was always meant to be mine. I don't know exactly what I'll build from here. Maybe I'll travel. Maybe I'll create something of my own. But I do know this: the ground under my feet finally feels like it belongs to me. And the truth, my truth, was worth every battle it took to claim.